A slave fixes the master's wife's bed, and she asks him not to go home. This single moment would ignite a dangerous connection neither could have foreseen. Isaac's skilled hands revealed more than just craftsmanship that day. They exposed a forbidden intelligence that fascinated the lonely Elizabeth. As thunder rolled across the plantation, her impulsive request for him to stay longer crossed a dangerous line. What began as a simple repair would spiral into a web of secrets, awakening desires, and impossible choices that threatened everything. And the master was coming home early. Virginia, 1851. The Willoughby plantation stood as a monument to Southern wealth, built on the backs of those who called its fields prison rather than home. Among them was Isaac, a 32-year-old craftsman whose hands could coax beauty from wood that others couldn't even see. Elizabeth Willoughby, the master's northern-born wife of just 6 months, was still adjusting to plantation life. At 22, she found herself alone more often than not, with her husband Thomas frequently away on business in Richmond. That morning, as rain threatened the horizon, the ornate mahogany bed frame that dominated her chamber had collapsed with a sickening crack. "I need the bed repaired before my husband returns," Elizabeth told the house servant, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. When Isaac entered her private chamber, a space forbidden to male slaves, his eyes remained fixed on the floor. "You called for a repair, Mrs.?" Elizabeth stood awkwardly by the window, painfully aware of the intimacy of having a man in her bedroom. "The frame. It's broken." She gestured vaguely toward the bed, unwilling to explain how it happened. Isaac approached cautiously. What he didn't know was that Elizabeth had been watching him for weeks from her window as he crafted furniture for her husband's study, fascinated by the contrast between his status and his evident skill. "Master returns tomorrow evening," she added, the warning clear in her voice. If the bed wasn't fixed, questions would be asked, questions neither of them wanted to answer. Isaac's hands moved with surprising grace for their size. He examined the fracture, fingers tracing the grain of the wood with such intimacy that Elizabeth found herself looking away. "The joint was poorly made," he said, forgetting himself momentarily. "Too much weight on one point." Elizabeth's eyebrows rose at his assessment. Slaves weren't supposed to offer opinions. As Isaac worked, she noticed how he measured twice without tools, how he anticipated problems before they arose. His movements weren't just practiced, they were elegant. When he finally stood back from the now stronger frame, Elizabeth saw something that disturbed her more than the broken bed ever could: pride. Not the false humility slaves were expected to show, but the genuine satisfaction of a craftsman. "It's better than before," she said, surprised at her own honesty. Isaac's eyes met, hers for the briefest moment before dropping again. "Thank you, Mrs." But what Elizabeth saw in Isaac's careful hands would change everything she thought she knew about the man her husband called property. And the storm clouds gathering outside were nothing compared to the tempest brewing between them. The afternoon sky darkened to a bruised purple as Elizabeth paced her bedroom. The bed was fixed, better than new, but her thoughts remained unsettled. She ran her fingers along the repaired joint, marveling at how seamlessly Isaac had strengthened what was broken. No evidence remained of the embarrassing collapse that had occurred when she'd thrown herself onto it in frustration after reading Thomas's letter announcing yet another delayed return. Thunder rumbled in the distance, a low warning that matched her unease. The house servants had already shuttered most windows, preparing for the deluge that had been threatening all day. Elizabeth moved to close her own when she spotted Isaac below, hurrying to secure tools in the workshop before the storm hit. His movements were efficient, purposeful, so different from the careful, measured pace he adopted when white folks were watching. Rain began to fall in heavy sheets just as he finished, soaking him instantly. Elizabeth watched him pause at the edge of the slave quarters path, hesitating as lightning split the sky. The quarters were a good quarter-mile from the main house, across an exposed field that was rapidly turning to mud. Even from her window, she could see how the wind bent the trees nearly sideways. A decision formed before she fully understood it, born perhaps from guilt, perhaps from curiosity, perhaps from something deeper she wasn't ready to name. She descended the stairs quickly, her skirts rustling against the polished wood, finding Mary, the head-house servant, in the kitchen where she was supervising dinner preparations. "The craftsman who repaired my bed. I need him to check something else before the storm worsens," Elizabeth said, trying to keep her voice casual despite the rapid beating of her heart. Mary's expression remained neutral, though her eyes held questions she knew better than to voice. At 53, Mary had served the Willoughby family since before Elizabeth was born, and she missed little. "Yes, Mrs. I'll send for Isaac." Elizabeth retreated to the parlor, suddenly uncertain of her impulsive decision. What exactly was she doing? Thomas would be furious if he knew she'd summoned a male slave to the house unnecessarily, especially one as valuable as Isaac. Her husband prided himself on maintaining strict boundaries with the people he owned, not cruel like some neighboring planters, but firm in his conviction that familiarity bred contempt. Minutes later, Isaac stood dripping on the service porch, confusion evident beneath his carefully composed features. Rainwater streamed from his clothes, forming puddles on the wooden boards beneath his feet. His soaked shirt clung to his shoulders, revealing the muscled frame usually hidden beneath loose work clothes. "Come in," Elizabeth said, aware of how this looked but unable to stop herself. "There's another matter requiring your attention." Isaac hesitated, clearly weighing the risks of entering the main house without explicit permission from the master. Lightning cracked again, illuminating the torrential downpour behind him. "Please," she added, softer this time. He stepped inside, careful to stay on the servants' runner that lined the hallway, designed to protect the expensive carpets from dirty boots. Elizabeth noted how he made himself smaller somehow, shoulders hunched, eyes downcast. The invisible man all slaves learn to become in white spaces. Inside, she led him not to her bedroom but to her husband's study. The room smelled of leather and tobacco, masculine territory where she rarely ventured. Thomas's domain, filled with his books, his correspondence, his business ledgers, and now, increasingly, with furniture made by Isaac's hands. "The storm," she began awkwardly, closing the door behind them. "It's too dangerous for you to return to the quarters now." Isaac remained silent, water pooling beneath his feet on the polished floor. His face betrayed nothing, but Elizabeth sensed his wariness. Unusual requests from white women could be just as dangerous to a slave as punishments from white men. "I noticed you've been making furniture," she continued, gesturing around the study. "For my husband's study." "Yes, Mrs. A writing desk and chair, and the bookcase by the window." His voice was low, measured, giving away nothing of his thoughts. "Show me." Isaac moved cautiously to the far corner where an unfinished cherrywood desk stood. His hand hovered over the surface, not quite touching it. Elizabeth noticed the contrast. These same hands had touched her bed frame without hesitation, but here in the master's study, different rules applied. "The craftsmanship is remarkable," she said, genuinely impressed by the intricate inlay work on the desktop. "My husband mentioned a craftsman, but he didn't say—" She trailed off, unsure how to finish without acknowledging the obvious. Thomas hadn't mentioned Isaac was a slave because it hadn't seemed worth noting. "You shouldn't be walking in this weather," Elizabeth said, the pretense thin even to her own ears. "And I'd like to understand your work, how you learned to create such pieces." The impropriety hung between them, impossible to ignore. A white woman alone with a slave, discussing craftsmanship as if they were equals. Outside, the storm provided cover for this unusual meeting, but Elizabeth knew she was crossing a line that Southern society had drawn in thick, indelible ink. "My father was a carpenter," Isaac said finally, his voice low but steady. "In Maryland, before I was sold south." Elizabeth hadn't expected this. A glimpse into his past, freely offered, The reminder of his history struck her with unexpected force. Of course he had a father, a family, a life before Willoughby Plantation. He taught you. Some, the basics, how to read the grain of wood, how to respect its nature instead of forcing it. For a moment his eyes lit with the memory. The rest I learned watching others. Master Willoughby doesn't know how much I can do. The admission carried risk. Slaves with valuable skills were often hired out, separated from what little community they had. A master could earn substantial income renting out a skilled craftsman to neighbors or businesses in town. "Your secret is safe," Elizabeth found herself saying, surprising them both. "But I want to know more, about how you work, the techniques you use." Outside, the storm intensified, rain lashing against windows like desperate fingers seeking entry. Lightning flashed in rapid succession, followed by thunder so loud it rattled the glass panes. The weather had provided her excuse, but Elizabeth recognized the dangerous territory she was entering. Every minute Isaac remained in the house increased the risk of discovery by other servants who might mention it to Thomas. Yet, as he began explaining the joinery techniques that made his furniture distinctive, she found herself leaning closer, drawn not just to his knowledge but to the transformation in his demeanor. When he spoke of woodworking, Isaac stood straighter, his voice gaining confidence. His hands, usually kept still and close to his body, now moved expressively, tracing shapes in the air as he described dovetail joints and hidden reinforcements. "Most furniture breaks because it's built to look impressive, not to last," he explained, gesturing to the desk's hidden supports. "Fancy carvings and thin legs. They catch the eye but can't bear weight. But beauty and strength can exist together. That's what my father taught me." Elizabeth felt something shift in her understanding, not just of furniture, but of the man before her. She'd been raised in Philadelphia, in a family with complicated views on slavery. Her father, a textile merchant, had done business with Southern planters while quietly supporting abolitionist causes. She'd grown up with contradictions, with whispered discussions of human dignity, alongside warnings about economic necessities. Marriage to Thomas had required compromise, acceptance of a way of life she'd been taught to question. She'd told herself that her husband was a good master, that his slaves were treated better than most. Yet standing here with Isaac, watching knowledge and passion transform him from property to person, those comfortable justifications felt hollow. "Like your repair to my bed," she said softly. "It's stronger now than when it was new." Their eyes met, and for the first time Isaac didn't immediately look away. Something passed between them, recognition, perhaps, of the other as fully human. A tremendous crack of thunder shook the house, breaking the moment. Both jumped, suddenly aware of how close they stood. The storm had knocked a branch against the window, a sharp reminder of the world outside this room. "You should go," Elizabeth said, her voice unsteady. "Yes, Mrs." Isaac moved toward the door, duty overriding common sense. The rain continued to pour in torrents visible through the study windows, turning the grounds into a dangerous landscape of mud and flooding creeks. "No," she said quickly, reaching out but stopping short of touching his arm. "I meant—" She hesitated, then finished. "Don't go home tonight. It's not safe." The words hung between them, laden with meanings neither dared acknowledge. Elizabeth felt her cheeks warm under his careful gaze. "The old carriage house has a loft," she continued, speaking quickly now. "It's dry there, and no one would question you taking shelter. I can have Mary bring food." Isaac's expression remained unreadable, but something flickered in his eyes. Caution, confusion, or perhaps a question about her motives that he couldn't safely voice. "As you wish, Mrs.," he said finally, his formal tone restored. But as he turned to leave, he added quietly, "Thank you." Elizabeth stood alone in the study after he'd gone, listening to the storm rage outside, wondering what forces she had set in motion with her impulsive kindness. The thunder seemed to echo her heartbeat, too fast, too loud, warning of dangers ahead. She moved to her husband's chair, running her fingers along the armrests Isaac had carved with subtle vine patterns, beautiful and strong together. The phrase lingered in her mind as the rain continued to fall, washing away old boundaries and carving new channels that would, in time, prove impossible to cross back over. The storm raged through the night, transforming the manicured grounds of Willoughby Plantation into a wild, sodden landscape. By morning, the creek that marked the eastern boundary had swollen beyond recognition, flooding the lower fields and threatening the bridge that connected the plantation to the main road. The disciplined rows of cotton plants now stood in murky water, their carefully tended order disrupted by nature's chaotic hand. Elizabeth woke early, her sleep disturbed by dreams she couldn't, or wouldn't, recall clearly. Fragments lingered at the edges of her consciousness, hands shaping wood, thunder that seemed to speak in human tones, and a sense of standing at the precipice of something both frightening and exhilarating. She pushed these images aside as she rose from bed, moving to her window as the first gray light of dawn seeped across the sky. The rain had finally stopped, but the aftermath remained. Branches scattered across the lawn, a shutter hanging askew from a second-floor window, and mud everywhere, as though the earth itself had rebelled against the ordered world Thomas Willoughby had imposed upon it. The gardens her husband had so meticulously planned, imported roses from England, geometric paths that mimicked those of great European estates, now lay flattened and formless, boundaries erased by the deluge. Her first thought was of Isaac. She dressed quickly, dismissing her lady's maid with claims of a headache. The young woman, Sarah, barely 16 and recently purchased from a neighboring plantation, looked relieved to escape her mistress's unusual mood. Once alone, Elizabeth moved to the window that overlooked the carriage house. Had he stayed there, as she suggested? Or had he risked the dangerous walk back to the quarters once the worst of the storm passed? The door to the carriage house opened, answering her question. Isaac emerged, glancing cautiously around before making his way toward the kitchen gardens. Even from a distance, Elizabeth could see he moved with purpose, clearly hoping to blend in with the early morning activities before his absence from the quarters was noted. His clothing was rumpled from sleep, but he'd clearly attempted to make himself presentable, smoothing his hair and straightening his collar. Elizabeth pressed her fingers against the cool glass, watching until he disappeared from view. She should feel relief, the impropriety of yesterday's conversation safely behind them, the unusual shelter arrangement undetected. Instead, she felt a curious emptiness, as though something half-formed had been snatched away. The connection that had sparked between them in the study, that rare moment of genuine human exchange across the boundaries of race and station, now seemed like something she might have imagined. "Mrs." Mary's voice startled her. The head house servant stood in the doorway, her expression carefully neutral, though her eyes missed nothing. "Mr. Peterson is here. Says there's urgent business with the flooding." Elizabeth withdrew her hand from the window quickly, wondering how long Mary had been observing her. "Of course. I'll see him in the morning room." "Shall I bring coffee?" Mary asked, her tone giving nothing away. "Yes, please. And some of yesterday's bread if the kitchen is running behind due to the storm." Mary nodded, turning to leave before pausing. "The carriage house weathered the storm well, I hear. Good thing, too. Master would be upset if anything happened to his new carriage." The comment seemed innocent enough, but Elizabeth caught the subtle emphasis. Mary knew, or suspected, that Isaac had spent the night there. The realization sent a chill through her. Mary had been with the Willoughby family for decades. Her loyalty would ultimately lie with Thomas, not with his new wife. "Indeed," Elizabeth replied evenly. "Please tell Mr. Peterson I'll be down shortly." Silas Peterson was Thomas's overseer, a thin, hard man with pale eyes that seemed to catalog every detail for future reference. At 45, he had the weathered look of someone who'd spent his life outdoors, though not in the healthy, sun-browned way of farmers. His was a sallow complexion, as though something essential had been leached from him over the years. Elizabeth had disliked him from their first meeting, though she kept this opinion to herself. Thomas valued Peterson's efficiency, if not his company. "Ma'am," Peterson said, removing his hat as she entered. His clothes were mud-splattered, evidence of an early inspection of the property. A thin stream of tobacco juice stained one corner of his mouth, which he wiped away with a handkerchief that had seen better days. "The bridge is gone, washed away in the night." "Gone?" Elizabeth repeated, grasping the significance immediately. "Then we're cut off from town." "Yes'm, for at least a week, I'd reckon, maybe more. The creek's still rising with runoff from the hills." Peterson twisted his hat in his hands, the brim already deformed from this habitual gesture. "There's more. The flood's taken part of the south field, cotton's under water, and the roof of the main barn is damaged." Elizabeth felt a flutter of anxiety. Thomas was due to return tomorrow, but without the bridge. "My husband." "Won't be coming home any time soon," Peterson finished for her. "Not unless he fancies a swim." His thin lips curved in what might have been meant as a smile. "Meaning, no disrespect, ma'am, but there's decisions need making. Repairs that can't wait." The implication was clear. With Thomas absent, who would give the necessary orders? In the 6 months of her marriage, Elizabeth had been carefully excluded from plantation management, encouraged instead to focus on household matters, entertaining, and the ornamental accomplishments expected of a planter's wife. Now, suddenly, she faced decisions with real consequences. Elizabeth straightened her shoulders, remembering her father's counting house in Philadelphia, where she had often helped with correspondence and accounts, skills Thomas had dismissed as unnecessary in her new role. "Make a list of what needs immediate attention, Mr. Peterson. We'll discuss priorities after breakfast." Surprise flickered across the overseer's face before he masked it. "As you wish, ma'am, though some matters require a firm hand." "I'm quite capable of firmness when required, Mr. Peterson." Elizabeth met his gaze steadily, refusing to be intimidated. "I'll expect your list within the hour." After he left, Elizabeth sank into a chair, her confident facade crumbling. What did she know about managing plantation repairs? About allocating labor and resources? Thomas had never bothered to explain such matters, considering them outside a wife's proper concerns. Yet she couldn't telegraph uncertainty, not to Peterson, who would seize any opportunity to undermine her authority in her husband's absence. Not to the house servants who watched her every move, evaluating whether this northern bride was worthy of respect. And certainly not to herself, having spent 6 months feeling increasingly ornamental and useless in this strange new world. Mary returned with coffee and bread, setting the tray down with precise movements. "Will there be anything else, Mrs.?" Elizabeth hesitated, then decided to risk a direct question. "How bad is the damage, Mary? You've been through storms here before." The older woman's expression softened slightly at being consulted. "Bad enough, Mrs. The creek floods most springs, but not like this, not in 20 years. She paused, seeming to weigh her next words. "Master usually has the men working dawn to dusk after weather like this. Says a day lost can't be recovered." Elizabeth nodded, absorbing this information. "Thank you, Mary. That will be all for now." Alone again, she sipped her coffee and considered her position. Thomas had left her with authority over household matters, but nothing beyond. Peterson clearly expected to make decisions himself, merely informing her as a courtesy. The easiest path would be to defer to him, but something in her rebelled at the thought. Perhaps it was her Philadelphia upbringing, where women, while certainly not equal to men, often managed businesses in their husbands' absences. Perhaps it was the subtle condescension in Peterson's manner. Or perhaps it was the memory of Isaac standing straighter, speaking with quiet authority about his craft, reminding her that capability often existed where others refused to see it. By midday, Elizabeth had approved emergency repairs to the barn roof and organized teams to salvage what crops could be saved from the flooded fields. She'd settled a dispute between two house servants and authorized extra rations for the field hands working in the mud. Each decision came with its own anxiety, but she found herself growing more confident with practice. Peterson had bristled at her involvement, particularly when she countermanded his decision to withhold the midday meal until a certain amount of work was completed. "These men are exhausted and soaked through," she'd said firmly. "They'll work better with food in their bellies." "Begging your pardon, ma'am," he'd replied, "not begging at all, but Molly coddling them just encourages laziness. Master Willoughby understands this." "My husband isn't here, Mr. Peterson. I am, and I say they eat now, then return to work." She'd met his cold stare with one of her own, refusing to back down despite her racing heart. Now, reviewing household accounts in Thomas's study, another boundary crossed, Elizabeth found herself wondering what her husband would say when he returned. Would he be proud of her initiative or angry at her presumption? Thomas Willoughby was a complicated man, capable of great charm and generosity, but also fiercely protective of his prerogatives as master of his domain. It was late afternoon when Mary informed her that Isaac requested permission to speak with her. "He says it's about the furniture for the master's study," Mary added, her tone carefully neutral. "Something about protecting it from water damage." Elizabeth's heart quickened. "Send him to the study. I'll meet him there." Mary's eyes lingered on her face a moment too long. "Yes, Mrs. Right away." When she entered the study a few minutes later, Isaac was examining the ceiling near the window, where a dark water stain spread across the plaster like an ink blot on fine paper. "There's a leak," he said without preamble, then seemed to remember himself, shoulders dropping into their customary submissive posture. "Begging your pardon, Mrs., but the rain's found its way in above the bookcase. The new one I built." Elizabeth moved closer, noting the dampness in the corner. The smell of wet plaster filled this section of the room, earthy and unpleasant. "Can it be repaired?" "The roof, yes, but we should move the furniture away from this wall until it's fixed." Isaac gestured to the massive bookcase, an impressive piece that Thomas had commissioned to house his growing collection of leather-bound volumes. "That's seasoned walnut. Water damage would ruin it." "Then we'll move it," Elizabeth decided. "Can you—" She stopped, realizing the bookcase was far too heavy for one person, filled as it was with books and Thomas's collection of geological specimens. "I'll have Mr. Peterson send some men to help you." Isaac's expression shifted subtly, a tightening around the eyes that she might not have noticed a day ago. "With respect, Mrs., those men won't know how to handle it properly. The joints are still settling. Rough treatment now could weaken them." Elizabeth understood the unspoken concern. Field hands accustomed to brute labor might not appreciate the craftsmanship involved. Or perhaps Isaac was reluctant to work under Peterson's direct supervision, given the overseer's reputation for finding fault with even the most diligent efforts. "What do you suggest?" "Jacob from the stables has helped me before, and young William. They'd be enough, with me showing them how." He hesitated, then added, "The bookcase needs to be emptied first, each shelf in turn, keeping track of where each book belongs. It's not just about strength." It was a reasonable request, yet Elizabeth hesitated. Isaac was making decisions, offering solutions rather than simply awaiting orders. Such initiative from a slave would not sit well with Peterson, who believed firmly in maintaining what he called proper discipline among the enslaved population. "Very well," she said finally. "I'll send word to have them report to you here, and I'll help with cataloging the books." The offer surprised them both. Ladies didn't engage in manual labor, even the relatively clean task of handling books. Isaac's eyes widened slightly. "That's not necessary, Mrs. Nevertheless, it's what I choose to do." Elizabeth moved to the desk, taking paper and pen. "We'll need to record where everything goes so it can be replaced correctly." Isaac nodded, relief evident in his shoulders. "Thank you, Mrs." As Elizabeth began noting the arrangement of books on the top shelf, a question formed that she couldn't suppress. "Yesterday, you mentioned your father taught you carpentry. Is he—" She paused, unsure how to ask delicately about a man who had likely been sold away from his son, as was common practice. "He died before I was sold," Isaac said quietly, his hands continuing their careful work of removing books. "Consumption took him when I was 15. My mother had passed years before." "I'm sorry," Elizabeth said, meaning it. The simple statement seemed woefully inadequate for the losses he'd endured, yet what more could she offer? Isaac's eyes met hers, surprise evident in them. Perhaps he wasn't accustomed to receiving sympathy from white folk. "He would have approved of this bookcase," he said after a moment. "Said working with Walnut was like dancing with a proud woman, had to respect her nature to bring out her beauty." The unexpected poetry in his words caught Elizabeth off guard. She tried to imagine Isaac's father, a skilled craftsman passing knowledge to his son, speaking in metaphors that transformed work into something approaching art. It was a vision of family life among slaves that Thomas and his friends never acknowledged in their discussions of the peculiar institution. Before she could respond, voices in the hallway announced Peterson's arrival. Isaac immediately stepped back from the bookcase, his expression closing, body language shifting to the familiar subservient posture that rendered him nearly invisible. "Ma'am," Peterson said, entering without knocking, "we've got trouble at the quarters. That new field hand, Caesar, is running a fever. Could be ague, could be worse." His eyes narrowed when he spotted Isaac. "What's this one doing in here?" The possessive phrasing, "this one," grated on Elizabeth's nerves in a way it wouldn't have just days ago. "Addressing a leak before it damages my husband's property," she replied coolly. "Mr. Willoughby would be most displeased if his new furniture were ruined through negligence." Peterson's jaw tightened at the implied criticism. "As you say, ma'am. About the sick Negro, quarantine him if you're concerned about contagion," Elizabeth said, drawing on dim memories of how her mother had handled illness among their Philadelphia servants. "And have Mary send down willowbark tea for the fever." She turned to Isaac. "You may proceed with moving the furniture, as discussed." It was a dismissal of both men, though only Peterson seemed to bristle at it. As they left, Isaac silently, Peterson with a stiff nod, Elizabeth felt a strange exhilaration. For the first time since her marriage, she was making consequential decisions, exercising authority beyond the narrow domestic sphere Thomas had allocated to her. More surprising was how natural it felt. The rest of the afternoon passed in a flurry of activity. Jacob and William arrived to help with the bookcase, and Elizabeth found herself working alongside them, recording the placement of each book and artifact. The three men moved with careful coordination, Isaac quietly directing their efforts with a competence that belied his status. "You've done this before," Elizabeth observed during a brief pause in their work. "Directed others, I mean." Isaac glanced at her, measuring his response. "My former master in Richmond hired me out to a cabinet-maker's shop. I supervised the apprentices there." This revelation startled her. "You lived in the city? Worked in a shop?" "For 3 years, yes, until Master Jenkins died and his widow sold me to pay his debts." Isaac's voice remained neutral, but Elizabeth caught the flicker of old pain in his expression. "That's how your husband acquired me." Elizabeth absorbed this information silently. Isaac had known a different kind of life. Not freedom, certainly, but something less restrictive than field labor on an isolated plantation. He'd had skills recognized, responsibility granted. And then, like the furniture they were now carefully dismantling, he'd been inventoried, valued, and sold to settle accounts. "Did you prefer it? The city?" she asked, keeping her voice low so Jacob and William wouldn't overhear. Isaac paused in his work, considering the question with a seriousness that suggested no one had asked his preference about anything in a very long time. There were possibilities there, he said finally. Books, conversations, news from other places. He resumed carefully removing drawers from the desk. But a slave is a slave, whether in town or country. The stark assessment hung in the air between them. Elizabeth wanted to say something, to acknowledge the injustice, to separate herself from it somehow, but what words could possibly bridge such a gulf? Instead, she returned to cataloging books, noting authors and titles with mechanical precision while her thoughts tumbled in disarray. That evening, alone in her bedroom, Elizabeth wrote a detailed letter to her husband, explaining the bridge collapse and the measures she'd taken in his absence. She described the property damage clinically, included Peterson's estimates for repairs, and outlined the work already underway. The pen moved smoothly across the paper, her handwriting neat and controlled despite the turmoil beneath the surface. Only in the final paragraph did her formal tone falter. I find myself unexpectedly capable in this crisis, Thomas. Perhaps there is more to your wife than either of us suspected. The responsibilities you've always sheltered me from. I don't find them as overwhelming as you might imagine. Indeed, there is a certain satisfaction in solving problems directly, rather than merely presiding over the social niceties of plantation life. She paused, pen hovering over the paper. Too bold? Thomas valued her gentility, her ornamental qualities. He had courted her precisely because she represented refinement, culture, a delicate northern flower to grace his southern mansion. Would he welcome this revelation of competence, or see it as an encroachment on his domain? After a moment's consideration, she crossed out the paragraph and rewrote, I count the days until your return, when these burdens may lift from my shoulders. The house seems empty without your presence, and I find myself quite overwhelmed by these unexpected duties. The lie tasted bitter, but Elizabeth folded the letter anyway. It would be days, perhaps weeks, before Thomas could receive it. By then, who knew what might change? The storm had already altered so much: the landscape, her daily routines, her understanding of her own capabilities. And something else, something more troubling, her perception of the people Thomas owned. They had always been there, of course, these enslaved men and women who maintained the plantation. Elizabeth had seen them daily, spoken to them, given orders. But they had existed in her mind as Thomas described them, as extensions of the property, as investments to be managed, as childlike beings requiring firm guidance. Now, after just one day of truly seeing Isaac, his intelligence, his skill, his carefully contained dignity, she found that comfortable fiction impossible to maintain. If she had been wrong about him, what else might she have misunderstood? Outside her window, lantern light glowed briefly in the distant carriage house. Isaac working late. Elizabeth watched until the light was extinguished, then drew her curtains against the night, against her own conflicted thoughts, against the strange new currents that seemed to be carrying her toward uncharted waters. In the darkness of her room, she recalled Isaac's words about his father's wisdom. Working with Walnut was like dancing with a proud woman, had to respect her nature to bring out her beauty. The metaphor lingered in her mind as she drifted toward sleep, raising uncomfortable questions about what her own nature might be, if she ever found the courage to truly discover it. A week passed with no sign of the floodwaters receding. The creek, normally a modest stream that children could wade across in summer, had transformed into a churning river that devoured more of the cotton fields with each passing day. The bridge remained an impossibility, its broken timbers occasionally visible when the current shifted, like bones of some massive creature half buried in mud. Elizabeth settled into a routine that would have been unthinkable before the storm. Each morning began with a meeting with Peterson, reviewing the previous day's work and planning the next. The overseer's initial resistance to her authority had hardened into a cold formality that barely masked his resentment, but Elizabeth found she cared less each day. Results mattered more than his approval. "The north field drainage ditches are cleared," Peterson reported, standing stiffly before her in Thomas's study. "But we've lost another acre on the south side. Ground just gave way." Elizabeth made a note in the ledger she'd begun keeping. "And the sick workers?" "Caesar's fever broke yesterday. He'll be back in the fields tomorrow." "Not until Dr. Mills examines him," Elizabeth countered. The local physician had managed to reach the plantation on horseback 2 days earlier, taking a circuitous route that added miles to his journey. Peterson's jaw tightened. "We're already short-handed, ma'am. Every man counts." "A relapse would cost us more than a day's labor," Elizabeth said firmly. "He rests until the doctor approves his return." The overseer's pale eyes narrowed, but he nodded curtly. "As you wish, ma'am." After he left, Elizabeth leaned back in Thomas's chair, another boundary crossed that now felt unremarkable. The past week had taught her more about plantation management than 6 months as a planter's wife. She knew now which fields drained poorly after heavy rain, which slaves possessed skills beyond their assigned tasks, which outbuildings needed repair before the next storm season. More surprisingly, she had discovered an aptitude for the work itself. The complex logistics of maintaining a large agricultural operation engaged her mind in ways that embroidery and social calls never had. Each problem solved, each crisis averted, brought a satisfaction that made her previous life seem pale by comparison. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called, expecting Mary with the mid-morning coffee. Instead, Isaac entered, carrying a wooden box. "Begging your pardon, Mrs. I finished the repairs to Master's desk." Elizabeth straightened, suddenly conscious of sitting in Thomas's chair. "So quickly? I thought it would take another week at least." "Found some seasoned cherry that matched close enough." Isaac set the box on a side table and opened it, revealing an assortment of small tools nestled in compartments. "Had to work nights to finish, but the weather's holding. Best to complete it before the next rain." Elizabeth rose and moved to the desk, running her fingers along the repaired section. The damage had occurred when part of the ceiling fell during the storm, gouging the polished surface. Now, she could barely detect where the new wood joined the old. "It's beautiful," she said honestly. "Thomas will be pleased." Isaac nodded, his expression carefully neutral at the mention of his master. "The joint's strong, but the color will deepen over time. By next year, you won't see any difference." Elizabeth studied his face, noting the shadows beneath his eyes. "You've been working at night? In the carriage house?" "Yes, Mrs., after regular duties." He hesitated, then added, "Mr. Peterson doesn't know about the workshop I've set up there." The admission hung between them, another secret shared. Elizabeth should discourage this unauthorized use of the building, should inform Peterson that Isaac needed proper supervision. Instead, she found herself asking, "Would you show me? Your workshop?" Isaac's surprise was evident, though quickly masked. "It's not much to see, Mrs." "Nevertheless, I'd like to." Elizabeth moved toward the door with a decisiveness that surprised even her. "Now, if you're not otherwise occupied." The walk to the carriage house took them across the back lawn, past the kitchen garden where several women were harvesting early summer vegetables. They nodded respectfully to Elizabeth, their eyes curious at the sight of their mistress walking alongside Isaac, though no one dared comment. The carriage house stood apart from the main cluster of outbuildings, a handsome structure built to house Thomas's prized vehicles. The lower level contained the carriages themselves, while the upper floor had originally served as quarters for the coachman, before Thomas decided he preferred having all house servants under one roof. Isaac led her to a side door, then up a narrow staircase to the loft. "Mind your step, Mrs. These boards can be slippery." Elizabeth gathered her skirts, acutely aware of the impropriety of the situation. A proper Southern lady would never enter such a space unchaperoned, certainly not with a male slave. Yet curiosity propelled her forward, into a world Thomas had never thought to show her. The loft was larger than she'd expected, with dormer windows that allowed natural light to flood the space. Isaac had clearly organized it with careful thought. A workbench ran along one wall, tools hung in precise arrangements above it, and several pieces of furniture in various stages of completion occupied the center of the room. "You made all this?" Elizabeth asked, moving toward a small table with intricately carved legs. "Yes, Mrs., when time allows." Isaac remained by the stairs, watching her explore his domain with an expression she couldn't quite read. Pride mingled with apprehension, perhaps. Elizabeth circled the space slowly, taking in details. Wood shavings curled on the floor beneath the workbench. The scent of linseed oil and beeswax hung in the air. A shelf held jars of pigments and stains, neatly labeled in a careful hand. "You can write," she said, not a question but a realization. Isaac stiffened slightly. "My father taught me some. Before." Teaching slaves to read or write was illegal in Virginia, as in most southern states. The fact that Isaac possessed this forbidden knowledge, and that he'd just admitted it to her, represented an enormous risk. "Your secret is safe with me," Elizabeth said quietly, echoing her words from the night of the storm. She moved to the workbench where drawings were pinned to the wall, designs for furniture, detailed sketches of joinery techniques, studies of leaf patterns for carving. "These are remarkable," she said, examining a drawing of a rocking chair with an innovative curved back. "Did you design this yourself?" Isaac moved closer, caution giving way to the pull of his craft. "Yes, been working on the curves. Traditional rockers don't support the back properly." He pointed to the drawing. "This design follows the natural shape of the spine." "Have you built it yet?" "No, Mrs. Don't have the right wood." A hint of frustration colored his voice. "Would need steam equipment, too, for bending the slats." Elizabeth studied the drawing more closely. "It reminds me of chairs I saw in Philadelphia, at the Exhibition of American Manufactures." Isaac's eyes lit with interest. "You've seen such things. My father took me when I was 16. There were furniture makers from all over the country." Elizabeth smiled at the memory. "He wanted me to appreciate craftsmanship, to understand the difference between things made with care and things made merely to sell." "Your father sounds like a wise man." "He was." Elizabeth felt a pang of homesickness. "He would have admired your work." The comment seemed to embarrass Isaac, who moved to adjust a tool on the bench. "It passes the time," he said, downplaying his obvious talent. Elizabeth continued her circuit of the room, stopping before a small chest of drawers. Unlike the other pieces, this one was finished, its surface gleaming with polish. The proportions were delicate, clearly designed for a lady's use, perhaps for jewelry or keepsakes. "This is exquisite," she said, running her fingers along the smooth edge. "Is it commissioned?" Isaac hesitated. "No, Mrs. It was for my wife." The revelation struck Elizabeth like a physical blow. "Your wife? I didn't know you were married." "Was married. Delia was sold 3 years ago. Master Jenkins' widow needed money quickly." Isaac's voice remained steady, but his hands clenched at his sides. "She was carrying our child when they took her. Never knew if it was a boy or girl." Elizabeth felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Of course, Isaac had a life beyond what she observed. Loves, losses, dreams that had nothing to do with serving the Willoughby household. Why had this never occurred to her before? "I'm so sorry," she said, the words wholly inadequate. "Do you know where she was sent?" "Louisiana, sugar plantation." The 2 words contained volumes of horror. Everyone knew the brutal conditions of sugar cultivation, the shortened lifespans of those who worked those fields. "You keep this for her," Elizabeth said, gesturing to the chest. In case we meet again in this life?" Isaac's smile held no humor. "No, Mrs. I keep it to remember I was once something more than property, that I created something beautiful for someone I loved. The raw honesty of his statement hung in the air between them. Elizabeth felt tears prick her eyes, ashamed of her own ignorance, her complicity in a system that could tear apart a family as casually as one might separate livestock. Before she could respond, voices drifted up from outside. Peterson, speaking to one of the stable boys. Isaac moved quickly to the window, then back to Elizabeth. "You should go, Mrs. The overseer's headed this way." Elizabeth nodded, gathering her composure. "Thank you for showing me your work. It's truly exceptional." Isaac's expression softened momentarily. "Thank you for seeing it as such." She descended the stairs quickly, emerging from the side door just as Peterson rounded the corner of the building. The overseer stopped short, surprise evident on his narrow face. "Ma'am, is everything all right?" Elizabeth straightened her shoulders. "Perfectly fine, Mr. Peterson. I was inspecting the carriage house roof for leaks. Isaac has been making repairs." Peterson's gaze shifted to the building, suspicion evident. "I wasn't aware of any work scheduled here." "Then your records are incomplete," Elizabeth replied coolly. "I authorized it 3 days ago. The last thing we need is damage to my husband's carriages." The lie came easily, surprising her. A month ago she would have struggled to deceive anyone, raised as she was to value honesty above most virtues. Now it seemed she was capable of more than she had realized, for better or worse. "Of course, ma'am." Peterson's tone suggested he was far from convinced. "Will there be anything else?" "Not at present." Elizabeth moved past him toward the main house, feeling his eyes on her back the entire way. That night, she sat at her writing desk, attempting to compose another letter to Thomas. The first had gone unanswered, presumably because the mail carrier couldn't cross the flooded creek. This one might face the same fate, but the act of writing helped organize her thoughts. "My dear husband, another week passes with no sign of the waters receding. Dr. Mills believes the bridge may not be repaired until late July as the supporting banks have been badly eroded. I continue to manage as best I can in your absence." Elizabeth paused, pen hovering over the paper. What could she tell Thomas of the past week? Of her growing confidence in giving orders, in making decisions that affected the entire plantation? Of her discovery of Isaac's workshop, his remarkable talents, the story of his wife torn from him? None of it, she realized. Thomas would be appalled at her interference in plantation management, horrified at her unchaperoned visit to the carriage house, and utterly unsympathetic to Isaac's personal tragedy. Her husband was not cruel by nature, but he viewed the world through the lens of property and propriety. Slaves were investments, their emotional lives irrelevant to the business of agriculture. "I have taken the liberty of authorizing some repairs in your absence," she continued, choosing her words carefully. "The storm damage was extensive, and certain matters could not wait for your return. Mr. Peterson has been most helpful, though I sense he finds it unusual to receive instructions from a woman. This much, at least, Thomas might find amusing rather than alarming." He often commented on Peterson's old-fashioned ways, his discomfort with any disruption to established hierarchies. "I find myself thinking often of our conversations about the plantation's future. Your vision for expanding the cotton production, improving the processing, equipment. There is much potential here, as you have always said." It was a safe topic, one that would please Thomas without revealing how much her own vision had expanded in recent days, how she had begun to see possibilities beyond being merely a planter's wife, possibilities that both excited and frightened her. Elizabeth completed the letter with conventional expressions of affection and set it aside to be sent if the opportunity arose. Then she moved to the window, drawn by the now familiar glow of lamplight in the carriage house loft. Isaac was working late again, creating beauty from raw materials, transforming wood into objects of function and grace, building a small world where he could exercise the skills and knowledge that the larger world denied him. Elizabeth watched until the light went out, then remained at the window, gazing into the darkness. The ground beneath her feet had shifted, and she wasn't certain she could find her way back to solid footing, or if she even wanted to. The sound of hoofbeats broke the morning stillness, drawing Elizabeth from her breakfast to the front veranda. A rider approached along the muddy drive, his horse splattered to the flanks with evidence of difficult travel. Behind him, to her astonishment, came a carriage, an elegant town coach that had no business on the rutted, half-flooded roads of rural Virginia. "Mary," she called over her shoulder, "we have visitors. Please prepare refreshments." The head house servant appeared at her side, squinting at the approaching party. "That looks like Judge Harrington's carriage, Mrs. From Richmond." Elizabeth felt a flutter of anxiety. Judge Harrington was one of Thomas's most important connections, a man whose favor could make or break a planter's social standing. What could possibly bring him to Willoughby Plantation with the bridge still out? The rider reached the house first, a young man in the dust-covered livery of a gentleman's servant. "Mrs. Willoughby," he called, removing his hat, "I bring a message from Judge Harrington and his daughter, Miss Caroline." "I am Mrs. Willoughby," Elizabeth confirmed, descending the steps. "What brings the judge this way? The roads must be treacherous." "The judge was visiting his brother's plantation when the storm hit, ma'am. They've been stranded these 3 weeks past." The young man glanced back at the approaching carriage. "The creek's gone down enough that we found a crossing point, but the bridge to Richmond is still out. The judge hopes you might offer hospitality until passage east becomes possible." Before Elizabeth could respond, the carriage pulled up to the house. The door opened to reveal Judge Harrington himself, a corpulent man in his 60s with a florid complexion and the imperious manner of one accustomed to deference. Behind him emerged a young woman, who could only be his daughter Caroline, a willowy blonde perhaps a year or two younger than Elizabeth. "Mrs. Willoughby," the judge boomed, approaching with outstretched hands. "Your reputation for hospitality precedes you. I trust we don't impose too greatly by seeking shelter under your roof?" Elizabeth summoned her most gracious smile, though her mind raced with the implications of unexpected guests. The house was not at its best after weeks of focusing on storm repairs rather than domestic perfection, and Thomas's absence would require explanation. "Judge Harrington, Miss Harrington, you are most welcome to Willoughby Plantation," she said, taking the older man's hands briefly before turning to his daughter. "Please, come inside out of this heat. Refreshments await, and we'll have rooms prepared immediately." Caroline Harrington offered a practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You're too kind, Mrs. Willoughby. We've heard so much about you from your husband." The mention of Thomas reminded Elizabeth of her predicament. As they moved into the front parlor, she explained the situation. "I'm afraid my husband is currently away from home. The storm washed out our eastern bridge, cutting off his return from business in Charleston." Judge Harrington settled his bulk into Thomas's favorite chair. "Most unfortunate. Thomas is a fine host, but I'm certain you'll manage admirably in his stead, my dear." The condescension in his tone was subtle but unmistakable. Elizabeth had encountered it often since her marriage, the assumption that, as a northern bride, she must be struggling to adapt to the demands of southern plantation society. "I shall do my best, sir," she replied with practiced humility, "though I fear our household is not as orderly as it might be, with so many repairs still underway." "Nonsense," the judge declared, accepting a glass of sherry from Mary's tray. "Thomas wrote that you've taken to plantation life like a duck to water. Said he'd never seen a woman adapt so quickly to new circumstances." Elizabeth blinked in surprise. Thomas had said this? To Judge Harrington, of all people? Her husband was usually sparing with praise, particularly regarding her management abilities. "You're too kind," she murmured, turning to Caroline. "Miss Harrington, you must be exhausted from your journey. Would you care to rest before dinner?" The young woman straightened in her seat. "Actually, I find I'm quite refreshed now that we've arrived. Perhaps you might show me the grounds. I've been cooped up at Uncle William's plantation for weeks with nothing but the company of elderly gentlemen." The request seemed innocent enough, but Elizabeth detected an undercurrent of assessment in Caroline's gaze. The judge's daughter was evaluating her, measuring her against some standard Elizabeth couldn't quite discern. "Of course," she agreed, "though I should warn you parts of the property remain underwater." "All the more interesting," Caroline replied with a smile that seemed more genuine than her previous one. "I've never seen the aftermath of such a significant flood." "Judge," Harrington waved a hand dismissively. "Off with you girls, then. I confess I could use a brief rest before dinner. The roads were most unkind to my constitution." Elizabeth instructed Mary to prepare the best guest rooms, then led Caroline out through the side door. They walked in silence for a few moments, following the gravel path that wound through Elizabeth's flower garden, or what remained of it after the deluge. "Your roses have suffered, I see," Caroline observed, pausing beside a bedraggled bush whose blooms hung heavy with mud. "Yes, I fear the storm was unkind to my gardening efforts," Elizabeth admitted, though the kitchen garden fared better, being on higher ground. Caroline nodded, then turned to face Elizabeth directly. "You must forgive my forwardness, Mrs. Willoughby, but I find myself intensely curious about you." Elizabeth raised an eyebrow. "About me? Whatever for?" "You've caused quite a stir in Richmond society," Caroline said with a frankness that bordered on impropriety. "A northern bride for one of Virginia's most eligible bachelors, and not just any northerner, but the daughter of Edward Blackwell, who is rumored to have abolitionist sympathies." The accusation, for that was what it was, however delicately phrased, hung in the air between them. Elizabeth felt her cheeks warm, but kept her expression neutral. "My father is a businessman with connections throughout the country," she replied carefully. "His political views are his own." Caroline's blue eyes remained fixed on Elizabeth's face, searching for, what? Weakness? Guilt? "And yours, Mrs. Willoughby? Do your views align with your father's or with your husband's?" The question was breathtakingly inappropriate from a young woman to her hostess, yet Elizabeth sensed that her answer mattered greatly. Caroline Harrington was not merely making conversation. She was probing for information that would be reported back to her father, and through him to Richmond society. "My views are those of a devoted wife," Elizabeth said smoothly, "concerned primarily with maintaining a comfortable home for my husband and extending hospitality to his friends, such as yourself and the judge." Caroline looked momentarily disappointed by this conventional response, but recovered quickly. "How diplomatic of you. Thomas always said you were remarkably intelligent." "Did he?" Elizabeth couldn't mask her surprise. Thomas rarely commented on her intellect, at least not to her face. "Oh, yes. At the Marshall's dinner party last spring he spoke quite admiringly of your education. Said you read Greek and Latin and understand mathematics better than most men of his acquaintance." Elizabeth felt a flush of pleasure at this unexpected praise, followed quickly by suspicion. Why would Caroline Harrington, practically a stranger, share such information? "Your father mentioned you've been stranded for 3 weeks," she said, changing the subject. "That must have been trying for you." Caroline accepted the shift with good grace. "Exceedingly. Uncle William's plantation is painfully dull. No young people at all, and his library consists entirely of agricultural treatises and sermons." She sighed dramatically. "I've been reduced to reading his ledgers for entertainment." Elizabeth laughed despite herself. "A desperate measure indeed. You'd be surprised how revealing a plantation's accounts can be," Caroline said, her tone lighter but her eyes still watchful. "Uncle William's, for instance, show a remarkable expenditure on medical care for his slaves, far above what most planters allocate." Again, the conversation had veered into potentially dangerous territory. Elizabeth chose her response carefully. "A healthy workforce is a productive one, I imagine." "Precisely what Uncle William says," Caroline agreed, though my father calls it sentimentality, a waste of good money. They had reached the edge of the formal gardens where the path split, one fork leading toward the stables, the other toward the workshops and carriage house. Elizabeth hesitated, suddenly reluctant to bring Caroline anywhere near Isaac's domain. "Shall we see the stables?" she suggested. "Thomas is quite proud of his horses." Caroline glanced toward the carriage house, then back to Elizabeth. "Actually, I'd love to see your husband's famous workshop. Father says Thomas has acquired a carpenter of exceptional skill. The desk in Father's study was made here, I believe." Elizabeth's heart sank. Of course, Judge Harrington would know about Isaac's work. Thomas had apparently been selling or gifting his furniture to influential connections. The carriage house workshop was no secret. Only Elizabeth's knowledge of it was new. "Of course," she said, forcing a smile. "Though I should warn you, it's a working space, not designed for visitors." They followed the path to the carriage house, where the sound of a saw greeted them before they reached the door. Elizabeth knocked loudly, then pushed the door open. Isaac stood at his workbench, a plank of oak secured in a vise as he worked. He looked up, surprise flickering across his face before he quickly lowered his eyes and set down his tools. "Isaac, this is Miss Harrington, Judge Harrington's daughter," Elizabeth said, her voice more formal than usual. "She's interested in seeing examples of your craftsmanship." Isaac bowed slightly. "Miss Harrington." Caroline moved into the workshop, her silk skirts incongruous among the wood shavings and tools. "So, you're the famous carpenter. My father speaks highly of your work." Isaac remained silent, his posture shifting subtly into the deferential stance expected when addressing white visitors. Elizabeth felt a pang, recognizing how different he appeared now compared to their private conversations. "Isaac created the desk in your father's study," she said, filling the awkward silence, "and he's currently working on pieces for several rooms in our house." Caroline circled the workshop, examining the furniture in various stages of completion. She paused before a partially carved headboard, running her fingers along the intricate pattern of vines and flowers. "Extraordinary detail," she murmured, then turned to Isaac. "Where did you learn such skill? Surely not on a plantation." The question, directed to a slave as though he were a craftsman worthy of inquiry, violated the social code Caroline had been raised to observe. Elizabeth watched Isaac carefully, noting the momentary surprise in his eyes before he responded. "My father taught me the basics, miss. The rest I learned through observation and practice." Caroline nodded, apparently satisfied with this answer. "Talent will find expression, regardless of circumstance." She turned to Elizabeth with a smile that seemed genuine for the first time. "You're fortunate to have such artistry at your disposal, Mrs. Willoughby. I imagine it gives you considerable advantage in furnishing your home." "Yes," Elizabeth agreed, unsure what to make of this strange interaction. "We're very fortunate." As they left the workshop, Caroline linked her arm through Elizabeth's in a gesture of unexpected familiarity. "I believe we'll be friends, Mrs. Willoughby," she announced. "You're not at all what I expected." "And what did you expect?" Elizabeth couldn't help asking. Caroline's laugh was musical, but her eyes remained shrewd. "A simpering northern miss, overwhelmed by the complexities of plantation management. Or worse, a secret radical, undermining Southern institutions from within." The directness of this assessment left Elizabeth momentarily speechless. Before she could formulate a response, Caroline continued, "Instead, I find a woman of intelligence and capability, who appears to have adapted admirably to her circumstances." She squeezed Elizabeth's arm lightly. How refreshing to be wrong. As they walked back toward the house, Elizabeth wondered what game Caroline Harrington was playing, and what role she herself had been assigned in it. Dinner that evening was a more elaborate affair than the household had seen since before the storm. Elizabeth had instructed the cook to prepare the judge's favorite dishes, information gleaned from Thomas's previous entertaining notes. The dining room gleamed with silver and crystal, evidence of Mary's efficient management of the house servants. "Excellent fare, Mrs. Willoughby," Judge Harrington declared, helping himself to a second serving of roast duck. "One would never guess your household has been laboring under such difficult conditions." "Thank you, Judge," Elizabeth replied. "The credit belongs to our cook, Bessie, and to Mary, who oversees the household staff." The judge nodded absently, more interested in his food than in acknowledging the skills of slaves. "I must say, I'm impressed by how well the plantation appears to be functioning in Thomas's absence. The grounds show evidence of substantial recovery from the flood." Elizabeth inclined, her head accepting the compliment. "Mr. Peterson has been diligent in directing the repair work." "Under your supervision, I understand," Caroline interjected. "Father, Mrs. Willoughby has been personally overseeing the plantation management during her husband's absence." Judge Harrington's eyebrows rose. Indeed, most unusual for a lady to involve herself in such matters. "Necessity often leads us down unexpected paths," Elizabeth replied, keeping her tone light. "I could hardly sit idle while the property suffered." "Quite right," the judge agreed, though his expression suggested he found the situation irregular. "Still, it speaks well of Thomas that his systems could be maintained even in his absence. A well-ordered plantation practically runs itself, with proper oversight." Elizabeth bit back a retort about just how much constant attention and decision-making the well-ordered plantation had required over the past weeks. Instead, she steered the conversation toward Richmond society, a topic on which both Harringtons were eager to expound. As the evening progressed, she found herself increasingly aware of Caroline's scrutiny. The younger woman missed nothing, not the way Elizabeth directed the servants with quiet authority, nor how she spoke knowledgeably about crop rotation when the judge raised the subject, nor the brief exchange with Peterson when he arrived with a report about a broken irrigation channel. Later, as they took coffee in the parlor, Judge Harrington settled into reminiscences about Thomas's father, with whom he had apparently shared a long friendship. "Old John Willoughby was a force of nature," the judge declared. "Built this plantation from practically nothing. Had an eye for opportunity, that man." "Thomas speaks of his father often," Elizabeth said politely, though in truth her husband rarely mentioned his family history. "As well he should. John Willoughby left his son not just land and slaves, but connections. Valuable connections." The judge tapped the side of his nose meaningfully. Those connections served Thomas well when he sought to expand his holdings, and when he went looking for a suitable bride. Elizabeth stiffened slightly. "I wasn't aware my husband's search for a wife involved business connections." The judge chuckled. "My dear girl, everything involves business connections in our world. Surely you know that your father's northern textile interests aligned neatly with Thomas's need for reliable buyers, a most advantageous match for both families." The implication that her marriage had been little more than a business transaction struck Elizabeth like a physical blow. Of course, she had known that Thomas's initial introduction to her family had come through mutual business associates, but she had wanted to believe, that his courtship had been motivated by genuine affection. "Father," Caroline interjected, clearly sensing Elizabeth's discomfort, "you make marriage sound so transactional. I'm sure Mr. Willoughby was primarily captivated by Mrs. Willoughby's many personal charms." The judge harumphed. Certainly. I meant no offense, Mrs. Willoughby. Thomas speaks of you with the greatest admiration. Says you've exceeded all his expectations as a wife." Somehow, this attempt at a compliment only made Elizabeth feel worse. Exceeded expectations, like a particularly promising investment. "You're too kind, Judge Harrington," she managed, rising from her seat. "And now, if you'll excuse me, I must check that your rooms have been properly prepared. The hour grows late, and you must be exhausted from your journey." After ensuring her guests were comfortably settled for the night, Elizabeth retreated to her bedroom. She sat at her window for a long time, staring out at the darkened plantation. The judge's casual remarks about her marriage had unsettled her deeply, forcing her to confront questions she had previously pushed aside. Had Thomas married her primarily for her father's business connections? Had her own attraction to him been similarly calculated, drawn to his wealth, his status, the escape he offered from her increasingly confined life in Philadelphia? And if their union had indeed been founded more on convenience than affection, what did that mean for their future? For her future? The lamp in the carriage house loft glowed steadily, a beacon in the darkness. Isaac was working late again, creating beauty in the small space where he could exercise some measure of autonomy. Elizabeth watched the light, finding comfort in its constancy. Whatever revelations tomorrow might bring, whatever uncomfortable truths she might have to face about her marriage, at least one thing remained certain. In that small workshop, something authentic was being created, something true. The thought sustained her as she finally turned from the window and prepared for bed, wondering what new challenges her unexpected guest would bring with the morning light.